Hello there and welcome to the Twilight Archive, where quiet curiosity meets the deep end of history and wonder is allowed to take its time. I'm your host, and if you're settling in for the evening, perhaps with a cup of tea, perhaps just letting the day finally wind down, then you've come to the right place. Tonight, we're not going to talk about distant galaxies or quantum mechanics. Instead, we're going to journey back over 3 millennia to witness something far more unsettling, something that happened right here on Earth. We're going to explore one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, how an entire world simply disappeared. Picture this, it's 1250 BCE, and you're standing on the walls of a great palace overlooking the Aegean Sea. The Bronze Age world stretches out before you in all its glory, a glittering network of civilizations that spans from the Greek mainland to the highlands of Turkey, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the banks of the Nile. This isn't the primitive past we sometimes imagine. These are sophisticated societies with international trade networks, complex writing systems, and technological achievements that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. Kings exchange diplomatic letters across vast distances. Merchants sail between ports speaking a dozen different languages. Bronze weapons gleam in the hands of professional armies, and massive stone fortresses guard the approaches to palace complexes that house thousands of people. And then, in the span of perhaps 50 years, a single human lifetime, it all comes crashing down. By 1150 BCE, that same view from the palace walls tells a very different story. The great fortress cities lie in ruins, many of them burned and abandoned. Trade routes that carried precious goods across the Mediterranean for centuries have gone silent. Writing systems that preserved the records of kings and merchants have been forgotten entirely. Populations have scattered or simply vanished. What had been the Bronze Age equivalent of our modern globalized world has collapsed so thoroughly that in some places, people forget how to write, forget how to work metal, forget the very technologies that had defined their civilization. This is what archaeologists call the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most puzzling catastrophes in human history. What makes it so mysterious isn't just the scale of the destruction, it's the speed. We're not talking about the gradual decline of the Roman Empire over centuries. This was sudden, violent, and seemingly coordinated across vast distances. Cities separated by hundreds of miles fell within decades of each other, often showing signs of fire, earthquake damage, or hasty abandonment. You might be wondering, how do we even know this happened? After all, we're talking about events that occurred over 3,000 years ago, long before anyone was keeping the kind of historical records we might rely on today. The answer lies buried in the archaeological record, in the layers of ash and destruction that mark the end of Bronze Age sites across the eastern Mediterranean, in the sudden disappearance of luxury goods and international trade items, in the abrupt changes in pottery styles and building techniques that suggest entirely new populations moving into abandoned territories. But perhaps most haunting of all are the written records that survived from the final moments of this world. At Ugaritic, a cosmopolitan trading city on the Syrian coast, archaeologists found tablets containing the last letters ever written in the Ugaritic script, desperate messages about enemy ships on the horizon and food shortages in the countryside. At Pylos, one of the great Mycenaean palace centers in Greece, Linear B tablets detail frantic preparations for some kind of assault, including orders to coastal watchers to keep vigilant lookout. These aren't the records of gradual decline, they read like emergency bulletins from a world under siege. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so fascinating to study, and so relevant to our own time, is that it forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the nature of civilization itself. How stable are the complex systems we build? What happens when the networks that connect our societies become so intricate that a disruption in one area cascades rapidly through the entire system? The Bronze Age world was, in many ways, the first truly interconnected civilization on Earth. Tin from Afghanistan was mixed with copper from Cyprus to make bronze weapons wielded by warriors in Greece. Cedar wood from Lebanon built the roofs of palaces in Turkey. Egyptian gold paid for Baltic amber that ended up in royal tombs across Europe. This interconnectedness brought unprecedented prosperity, but it also created unprecedented vulnerability. When the system began to fail, it failed everywhere at once. Over the next few hours, we're going to explore this lost world and the various theories about what brought it to such a sudden and dramatic end. We'll walk through the great palace centers of Mycenaean Greece, explore the diplomatic archives of the Hittite Empire, and examine the final desperate messages from trading cities as they faced their doom. We'll consider the role of mysterious invaders the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, investigate evidence for climate change and natural disasters, and explore how the very complexity that made Bronze Age civilization so successful might have contained the seeds of its own destruction. But before we dive into the specific civilizations and the detailed theories about their collapse, I want us to spend a moment simply appreciating the magnitude of what we're discussing. Imagine if our own world, with all its technology, its global trade networks, its vast cities, were to suddenly collapse so completely that 3,000 years from now, future archaeologists would puzzle over layers of ash and wonder what had happened to us. That's essentially what we're looking at when we study the Late Bronze Age collapse, the end of a world that its inhabitants probably thought would last forever. And perhaps most unsettling of all, we still don't know exactly what caused it. Was it invasion? Climate change? Economic collapse? Earthquake storms? Social revolution? Probably some combination of all these factors, interacting in ways that created a perfect storm of destruction. What we do know is that it happened quickly, and it changed the course of human history forever. So settle in as we journey back to that lost world, to witness both its glory and its mysterious end. Because understanding how civilizations fall isn't just about satisfying our curiosity about the past, it's about understanding something fundamental about the fragility and resilience of the complex societies we build. The Bronze Age collapse has lessons for us, whispered across 3 millennia of silence, about what it means to live in an interconnected world. To understand how something ends, we first have to understand what was lost. And what was lost in the Bronze Age collapse wasn't some collection of mud huts and tribal settlements. No, what vanished around 1200 BCE was a glittering, sophisticated world that would have seemed almost magical to the Dark Age peoples who came after. Picture this: you're standing on a hilltop in what we now call Greece, looking out over the Ugaritic plain around 1250 BCE. Below you, the massive walls of Mycenae rise like something from a fever dream, stones so enormous that later Greeks would swear they'd been built by giants. These aren't just walls, they're statements of power, each block quarried and fitted with engineering precision that wouldn't be seen again in Greece for centuries after the collapse. But the walls are just the beginning. Inside those fortifications, scribes are bent over clay tablets, carefully inscribing symbols in what we now call Linear B script. They're recording everything: sheep counts, bronze allocations, offerings to the gods, even the specific amounts of perfumed oil required for religious ceremonies. This is bureaucracy on a scale that would make a modern government proud. These Mycenaean palaces weren't just royal residences, they were the beating hearts of complex economic systems that managed thousands of people across entire regions. Now let's shift our gaze northward, across the Aegean to the highlands of Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire is flexing its muscles. If Mycenae impresses you, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, will leave you speechless. We're talking about a city that sprawled across nearly 300 acres, protected by walls that stretched for more than 4 miles. Within those walls, the great temple complex alone covered more ground than many entire medieval towns. The Hittites weren't just building big, they were innovating. While most of the world was still working with bronze, Hittite smiths had mastered the secrets of iron. They understood that the right combination of heating, cooling, and carbon could produce metal that was both harder and more flexible than bronze. It was revolutionary technology, and they guarded it jealously. Think of it as the military-industrial equivalent of nuclear secrets in our own time. But here's what makes the Hittite Empire truly remarkable: they were diplomats as much as warriors. Their archives contain thousands of cuneiform tablets recording treaties, trade agreements, and correspondence with other powers. They weren't just corresponding with neighbors, either. Letters flew back and forth between Hattusa and Egypt, between Hittite kings and Babylonian rulers, creating a web of international relations that spanned the known world. One particularly fascinating letter comes from the Hittite queen Puduhepa to Rameses II of Egypt, complaining about the quality of a medical specialist Egypt had sent to treat her illness. Imagine that, we're talking about international medical consultations in the 13th century BCE. This is sophisticated diplomacy, the kind that requires not just writing systems but translators, ambassadors, and established protocols for international communication. As we continue our journey eastward, we encounter something even more cosmopolitan. The city of Ugaritic, perched on the Syrian coast, was essentially the Hong Kong of the Bronze Age world. Archaeologists have found tablets there written in 8 different languages using 5 different writing systems. We're talking about Akkadian cuneiform sitting alongside Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hittite records next to Hurrian texts, and the alphabetic script that the Ugaritians themselves had developed. You might be wondering, how does a single city become such a melting pot? The answer lies in trade. Ugaritic sat at the crossroads of 3 continents, where goods from as far away as Afghanistan and Britain passed through its harbors. Tin from the mountains of Central Asia was mixed with copper from Cyprus to create the bronze that gave this entire age its name. Baltic amber found its way into Egyptian tombs, while Nubian gold traveled north to adorn Mycenaean princesses. This wasn't random exchange, either. The Late Bronze Age had developed what we can only call the world's first global economy. Standardized weights and measures allowed merchants from different cultures to trade with confidence. Diplomatic marriages linked royal houses across thousands of miles. When the pharaoh of Egypt wanted to impress foreign dignitaries, he might serve them wine that had traveled from the hills of Greece, sweetened with honey from Anatolia, served in vessels crafted from silver mined in Spain. The sophistication goes deeper than trade goods, though. These civilizations had developed complex metallurgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries after the collapse. They could create bronze alloys with precisely controlled compositions, producing everything from delicate jewelry to massive weapons and tools. They understood chemistry in ways that seem almost modern, mixing metals, controlling temperatures, creating composite materials. Their agricultural systems were equally advanced. The Mycenaeans had developed elaborate irrigation networks and terracing systems that maximized crop yields from marginal land. Palace records show they were practicing crop rotation, managing livestock breeding programs, and maintaining strategic food reserves that could sustain populations through multiple years of poor harvests. And the art, the art they created. Minoan frescoes show scenes of such liveliness and naturalism that they seem to breathe on the walls. Mycenaean goldsmiths created death masks so realistic that when Heinrich Schliemann first uncovered one at Mycenae, he telegraphed the king of Greece claiming he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. Hittite reliefs carved into living rock at Yazilika create processional scenes of gods and kings that seem to march eternally across the stone. This was a world of international law, where treaties were sworn before the gods and witnessed by natural forces. The mountains and rivers themselves were called upon to guarantee agreements between kings. It was a world where merchants could travel safely across thousands of miles, protected by networks of mutual agreements and shared interests. But perhaps most remarkably, it was a world where knowledge flowed as freely as trade goods. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, medical procedures, and engineering techniques spread from culture to culture, constantly refined and improved. The cuneiform tablets from this period read like technical manuals, filled with detailed instructions for everything from glassmaking to surgical procedures. So when we talk about the Bronze Age collapse, we're not discussing the fall of primitive societies. We're talking about the sudden, catastrophic end of humanity's first truly international civilization, a world whose complexity wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. And that makes what happened next all the more mysterious. To understand just how mysterious this collapse really was, we need to meet one of the Bronze Age world's most remarkable powers, a civilization that controlled the crossroads between Europe and Asia, pioneered revolutionary technologies, and built one of the most impressive capitals the ancient world had ever seen. We need to visit the Hittites. If you're like most people, the names Hittites might sound vaguely familiar from Sunday school or maybe a history class you half remember. But here's what's fascinating. Until about a century ago, they were basically ghosts. Biblical references, a few scattered mentions in Egyptian texts, and that was about it. Then archaeologists began digging in the highlands of central Turkey, and what they found changed everything. They uncovered an empire that had been completely forgotten by history. Picture this, sometime around 1650 BCE, in the rugged Anatolian highlands where the seasons are harsh and the landscape unforgiving, a people we call the Hittites began building something extraordinary. They weren't content to remain a regional power tucked away in their mountain valleys. Over the next 4 centuries, they would expand their influence until their empire stretched from the Aegean coast to the edges of Mesopotamia, becoming one of the great superpowers of the ancient world. Their capital was a place called Hattusa, and if you could have approached it in its heyday around 1300 BCE, you would have seen something that rivaled anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Massive stone walls, some stretching 6 kilometers around the city, punctuated by elaborate gates decorated with carved lions and warriors. The Great Temple alone covered an area the size of several city blocks, its storerooms packed with goods from across the known world. This wasn't some barbarian stronghold. This was urban planning on a Bronze Age scale that wouldn't be matched in that region until the Ottoman Empire. But here's where the Hittites become really interesting for our story. They were innovators in ways that would shape the future of civilization, even as their own was about to end. Most famously, they were among the first people to master iron working on an industrial scale. Now, you might wonder why this matters. After all, we're talking about the Bronze Age, right? Well, that's exactly the point. The Hittites were already moving beyond bronze. Iron is everywhere, it's the 4th most common element in Earth's crust. But working with it is much more complicated than working with bronze. Bronze melts at a relatively manageable temperature, and you can pour it into molds to create tools and weapons. Iron needs to be heated until it's red hot and then hammered, folded, and shaped while it glows. It's harder to work with, but the results are worth it. Iron tools hold a sharper edge longer. Iron weapons can punch through bronze armor like it's barely there. The Hittites figured this out, and for a time, it gave them a tremendous military advantage. Their iron weapons were so superior that iron itself became a kind of strategic resource, one they guarded jealously. In fact, there's a letter from a Hittite king to another ruler who had requested some iron, and the king's response is essentially, "Sorry, but iron is really hard to make right now, and we need it all for ourselves." Imagine if a country today said they couldn't export computer chips because they needed them all domestically. That's how valuable iron was. But it wasn't just their metallurgy that made the Hittites remarkable. They were also master diplomats, and this is where we start to see just how sophisticated and interconnected the late Bronze Age world really was. The Hittite royal archives, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, reveal a civilization that was in constant communication with powers across the ancient world. We have letters between Hittite kings and Egyptian pharaohs that read like correspondence between modern heads of state. They discuss trade agreements, marriage alliances, mutual defense pacts. There's even one exchange where a Hittite king complains to the pharaoh that Egyptian merchants aren't being treated fairly in Hittite territory, and could Egypt please return the favor by protecting Hittite traders in Egyptian cities. This is international law being worked out in real time, 3,000 years ago. One of the most famous examples is the treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, signed around 1259 BCE. This wasn't just some temporary ceasefire, it was a comprehensive peace agreement that established borders, outlined extradition procedures for refugees, and even included clauses about what to do if either ruler died and a succession dispute arose. The treaty was carved in stone in both Hattusa and the Egyptian capital, and copies were sent to other major powers as a kind of international announcement. When archaeologists found the Hittite version at Hattusa, they realized they were looking at one of humanity's first written peace treaties. This level of diplomatic sophistication tells us something crucial about the world the Hittites inhabited. This wasn't a collection of isolated city-states occasionally raiding each other. This was a genuine international system, complete with established protocols, recognized borders, and complex relationships that spanned continents. The Hittites were players on a stage that stretched from Greece to Mesopotamia, from the Black Sea to the edges of Africa. And then, sometime around 1180 BCE, it all ended. Not gradually. Not with a slow decline over generations. The great city of Hattusa was abandoned and burned so thoroughly that when archaeologists found it, they could still see the scorch marks on the stones. The extensive Hittite archives just stop. No more diplomatic correspondence. No more administrative records. No more anything. What makes this abandonment particularly puzzling is that there's no clear evidence of conquest. No foreign army left inscriptions claiming victory. No mass graves suggesting a siege. The city appears to have been evacuated, then systematically destroyed, but by whom and why remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. Some scholars suggest the Hittites destroyed their own capital rather than let it fall to enemies. Others think internal conflicts tore the empire apart from within. But here's what's really unsettling: the collapse of Hattusa wasn't an isolated event. As we'll see, it was part of a pattern that was playing out across the entire eastern Mediterranean world. The same decades that saw the end of the Hittite Empire would witness the fall of civilizations from Greece to the Levant. The question we're left with is whether these collapses were connected, and if so, how? What could have brought down an empire that had survived and thrived for centuries? That question leads us south and west, to another great Bronze Age civilization that was about to meet its own mysterious end. If you've ever visited the hilltop citadel of Mycenae in southern Greece, you know the feeling. Standing among those massive stone walls, looking out across the Argolid plain, you can almost hear the echo of Bronze Age power. These aren't just ruins, they're the remnants of a civilization that Homer would later call rich in gold, a world that seemed unshakable in its dominance. Yet like the Hittites we just encountered, the Mycenaeans would vanish almost completely, leaving behind only stones and stories. The Mycenaean civilization emerged around 1650 BCE, and for 5 centuries, they were the undisputed masters of mainland Greece. Picture fortress palaces perched on strategic hilltops, Mycenae itself, of course, but also Tiryns with its incredible cyclopean masonry, Pylos overlooking the western coast, and dozens of smaller centers scattered across the Greek landscape. These weren't just military strongholds. They were the beating hearts of a complex, interconnected society. We know this because the Mycenaeans left us something remarkable: thousands of clay tablets covered in what we now call Linear B script. You might be wondering how we can read these ancient records. Well, that's one of archaeology's greatest detective stories. For decades after their discovery, Linear B remained a complete mystery. The symbols looked nothing like any known writing system, and the tablets seemed to hold their secrets jealously. Then in 1952, a young British architect named Michael Ventris did something extraordinary. Working purely with the patterns in the script, the frequency of certain symbols, the way they clustered together, he began to suspect that Linear B might represent an early form of Greek. It was a bold hypothesis. Most scholars believed Greek civilization began much later, with the classical city-states we all know from history books. Ventris was right. When he applied Greek phonetic values to the Linear B symbols, the tablets suddenly began to speak. And what they revealed was astounding: a sophisticated palace economy operating centuries before Homer, centuries before classical Athens. These weren't primitive scratches on clay. They were the detailed administrative records of a complex Bronze Age state. Let's slow down and ask something basic: what exactly do these tablets tell us? The answer transforms our understanding of Mycenaean society. We're looking at inventories of livestock, thousands of sheep, hundreds of cattle, carefully counted and categorized. We see lists of workers with their specializations: bronze smiths, potters, perfume makers, chariot builders. There are land tenure records, showing how the palace controlled and allocated agricultural territories. There are even records of religious offerings, giving us glimpses into Mycenaean spiritual life. One tablet from Pylos lists the Coast Guard stationed to watch for raiders from the sea, a haunting detail when you remember what was coming. Another records the final desperate attempts to gather bronze for weapons as the palace system began to crumble. These aren't just administrative documents. They're the last whispers of a dying world. The picture that emerges is of a highly centralized society organized around massive palace complexes. The palace wasn't just where the king lived, it was the economic engine of the entire region. Imagine walking through the Great Hall at Pylos in its heyday. You'd see scribes bent over their tablets, recording every sheep sheared, every jar of olive oil produced, every bronze spear point forged. Raw materials flowed in from the countryside, finished goods flowed out, and the palace bureaucrats tracked it all with meticulous care. This system worked brilliantly for centuries. The Mycenaeans became master traders, sending their distinctive pottery across the Mediterranean. They built impressive networks of roads connecting their palace centers. Their craftsmen produced exquisite gold work. Just look at the famous Mask of Agamemnon, though we now know it predates the Trojan War hero by centuries. Their engineers constructed those incredible Cyclopean walls using stones so massive that later Greeks believed only the Cyclopes could have lifted them. But here's what makes the Mycenaean collapse so puzzling: they were apparently thriving right up until the end. The Linear B tablets from the final years show no signs of gradual decline, no indication that the palace administrators saw catastrophe approaching. The records are detailed and routine right until they suddenly stop. It's as if someone simply turned off the lights. And when those lights went out, they stayed out for a very long time. By 1150 BCE, every major Mycenaean palace had been destroyed or abandoned. The sophisticated administrative system vanished overnight. Most remarkably, the ability to write disappeared entirely from Greece. Think about that for a moment: an entire civilization forgot how to read and write. The Linear B script that had recorded centuries of palace administration became as mysterious to later Greeks as it was to modern archaeologists before Ventris cracked the code. This wasn't just political collapse, it was cultural amnesia on a massive scale. When writing returned to Greece centuries later, it came in the form of the familiar Greek alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians. The knowledge preserved in those thousands of Linear B tablets was lost, not to be recovered until the 20th century. What could cause such complete systemic failure? The archaeological evidence tells a dramatic story. At site after site, we find the same pattern: massive destruction layers, evidence of intense fires, hasty burials of valuable objects. Some palaces show signs of having been deliberately destroyed, their walls pulled down, their storage areas ransacked. Others seem to have been simply abandoned, left to decay as their populations melted away. The human cost was staggering. Greece's population appears to have dropped by as much as 75% between 1200 and 1100 BCE. Entire regions that had supported thriving communities became essentially empty. The survivors scattered, retreating to small, isolated settlements that left little trace in the archaeological record. The age of heroes that Homer sang about had ended not in glorious battle, but in mysterious catastrophe. Yet some elements of Mycenaean civilization did survive, preserved in the oral traditions that would eventually become Homer's epics. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed centuries later, still carry echoes of Bronze Age Greece, descriptions of palace life, details of Bronze Age warfare, even specific artifacts that archaeologists have uncovered in Mycenaean ruins. It's as if the collective memory of Greek civilization preserved fragments of a lost golden age, waiting to be rediscovered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece was part of something much larger, a catastrophe that swept across the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. To understand what happened to these Greek palace kingdoms, we need to look north and east, to another great Bronze Age civilization that met its end in the same dark decades. That brings us to a place that was, in many ways, the New York City of the Bronze Age world. On the coast of what is now Syria, where the Mediterranean laps against ancient stones, archaeologists have uncovered one of history's most remarkable urban centers. This was Ugaritic, a name that might not roll off your tongue the way Athens or Rome does, but a city that, for centuries, stood as the beating heart of international Bronze Age civilization. Imagine walking through Ugaritic streets around 1250 BCE. You might hear a Hittite merchant negotiating with an Egyptian trader in the morning, then catch fragments of Akkadian as scribes conduct diplomatic correspondence in the afternoon. By evening, you could listen to hurried songs drifting from a tavern while Cypriot sailors discuss copper prices nearby. This wasn't just cultural diversity, this was the sound of a world economy humming along. We know this because Ugaritic has given us something extraordinary, thousands of tablets written in 8 different languages and 5 different scripts. The royal archives alone contained over 1,400 tablets when French archaeologists began excavating in the 1920s. These weren't just administrative records, though there were plenty of those. We have epic poems, religious texts, personal letters, international treaties, and commercial contracts. It's as if someone preserved a snapshot of an entire civilization's intellectual life. But what made Ugaritic truly special was its position at the crossroads of empires. The city sat where the trade routes from Mesopotamia met the sea lanes that connected Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Merchants from across the known world converged here, bringing not just goods but ideas, technologies, and stories. The city's scribes became masters of multilingual communication, switching between cuneiform for official documents, their own alphabetic script for local affairs, and hieroglyphic symbols when corresponding with Egypt. You might wonder how we know so much about daily life in this ancient city. The answer lies in what archaeologists call the Pompeii effect. Like that Roman city frozen by volcanic ash, Ugaritic was abandoned so suddenly that people left everything behind. Tablets were scattered where scribes dropped them. Tools lay on workshop floors. Jewelry remained in houses. The city became an accidental time capsule, preserving a moment when Bronze Age civilization was at its peak. And that's what makes Ugaritic's final chapter so haunting. Among those thousands of tablets, archaeologists found letters that read like dispatches from a disaster movie. One message, written by the city's last king, Amurapi, is addressed to the king of Cyprus. It's desperate: "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." He continues, "Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself." There's something almost modern about that plea, a leader watching his world crumble while his military forces are deployed elsewhere, unable to defend what matters most. Another tablet, found scattered with others in what appears to be a scribe's final, frantic work session, simply states, "When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked." We can almost feel the panic in these hastily written messages. Some tablets show signs of being fired in the very conflagration that destroyed the palace, emergency communications baked into permanence by the flames that ended their civilization. One letter was discovered still in its envelope, as if a messenger had arrived just as the city fell. But who were these enemies that Hammurabi wrote about? The tablets give us tantalizing clues but no clear answers. Some mention ships, lots of ships. Others refer to people from the sea, raiders who seem to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. These attackers weren't interested in conquest in the traditional sense. They didn't try to rule Ugarit or extract tribute. They simply destroyed it and moved on. What's particularly striking is how quickly Ugarit's international connections became liabilities. The same trade networks that had made the city wealthy now became pathways for destruction. Raiders could follow established shipping routes, attacking one port after another. The very interconnectedness that had created Bronze Age prosperity made the system vulnerable to cascading failure. The archaeological evidence tells us that Ugarit's end came around 1185 BCE, give or take a few years. The destruction was thorough. Fires burned hot enough to crack stone walls and melt bronze objects. But this wasn't random violence. Someone took the time to smash the city's religious statues and overturn its altars. This was cultural destruction, an attempt to erase not just Ugarit's physical presence but its spiritual identity. And yet, even in that final catastrophe, we can see signs of human resilience. Some tablets were hidden away, as if scribes hoped to preserve their city's memory for future generations. Others were buried with valuables, suggesting that some inhabitants had time to prepare, even if they couldn't save their city. After the destruction, Ugarit was never rebuilt. The site was gradually covered by sand and time, its existence forgotten until modern archaeologists rediscovered it. But the city's legacy lived on in unexpected ways. That alphabetic script I mentioned, the one Ugaritic scribes used for local affairs, was one of humanity's earliest alphabets. It would influence the development of Phoenician writing, which in turn gave birth to Greek letters, and eventually to the very alphabet we use today. So when we type on our keyboards or write with our pens, we're using a technology that can trace its ancestry back to those multilingual scribes working in a Bronze Age trading post on the Syrian coast. It's a reminder that even when civilizations fall, their innovations often survive, passed down through generations like cultural DNA. The fall of Ugarit wasn't an isolated tragedy. Those final, desperate letters were being written as similar scenes played out across the Bronze Age world. From the Syrian coast to the Greek mainland, from Anatolia to the Levant, the same mysterious forces were bringing down civilization after civilization. But who were these destroyers, and where did they come from? To answer that, we need to turn to the one civilization that survived their assault and left us detailed records of the encounter. The scribes of Rameses III were meticulous record keepers, and in the 8th year of his reign, around 1175 BCE, they carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu one of history's most haunting accounts. The Sea Peoples had come. Not once, but twice, these mysterious invaders had swept across the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt, alone among the great Bronze Age powers, had managed to turn them back. But who exactly were the Sea Peoples? Even their name comes to us filtered through Egyptian hieroglyphs, which gives us confederations with names like the Pele-Set, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen. These weren't necessarily unified armies marching under a single banner. The Egyptian records suggest something more complex, a massive migration of displaced populations, some traveling by sea, others overland, bringing with them not just warriors but entire families, their possessions loaded onto ox carts. You might be wondering how we can be so specific about events from over 3,000 years ago. The answer lies in those temple walls at Medinet Habu, where Egyptian artists carved detailed reliefs of the battles. We see ships with distinctive high prows and stern posts, warriors wearing feathered headdresses, and most tellingly, we see families, women and children traveling alongside the fighters. This wasn't just a raid. It was something approaching a folk migration. The Egyptian account describes two main waves of attacks. The first came during the reign of Merneptah around 1207 BCE, when a coalition of sea peoples allied with the Libyans attempted to invade the fertile Nile Delta. Egypt repelled them, but barely. The second wave, the one that Ramesses III faced, was larger and more desperate. By then, the sea peoples had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and laid waste to cities across the Levant. Egypt was their last target, or perhaps their last hope. Now here's where things get fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. The Egyptian records tell us what the sea peoples did, but they're remarkably vague about where they came from. The hieroglyphs mention Thailand and in the midst of the sea, which could refer to anywhere from Sardinia to Cyprus to the Aegean. Modern scholars have spent decades trying to match these ancient names to known peoples and places, and while some connections seem likely, the Pele set may indeed be the Philistines who settled in Canaan, others remain tantalizingly uncertain. Let's pause and consider what we're really looking at here. The sea peoples appear in our historical record just as the Bronze Age world is collapsing around them. Coincidence? Almost certainly not. But that raises a crucial question: were they the cause of the collapse, or were they refugees from it? The evidence suggests both, in different places and at different times. Some sea peoples groups may have been displaced by the very disasters that were destroying Bronze Age civilization elsewhere: climate change, internal conflicts, or natural disasters forcing entire populations to seek new homes. But once they were on the move, they became agents of destruction themselves, either through deliberate conquest or simply through the disruption that massive population movements inevitably cause. Consider the archaeological evidence from Ugaritic, which we discussed earlier. The city's destruction layers contain arrowheads of types not previously found in the region, suggesting foreign attackers. But we also find signs that the city was already under stress: food shortages, defensive preparations, a sense of impending doom that permeates those final letters. Perhaps the sea peoples didn't create the crisis so much as deliver the final blow to civilizations already weakened by other pressures. There's something almost poetic about how these mysterious raiders slip in and out of our historical vision. They appear in Egyptian records as existential threats, then vanish from the written record almost as suddenly as they arrived. Some of them, like the Peleset Philistines, settled down and became part of the new post-collapse world. Others seem to have melted back into the general population of the Eastern Mediterranean, their identity absorbed into the complex ethnic mosaic of the Iron Age. But here's what makes the Sea People's story so compelling from our modern perspective: we're looking at what appears to be a massive refugee crisis, complete with the kind of complex interactions between displaced populations and established states that we recognize from our own world. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just about cities burning or palaces falling. It was about people, entire cultures, being set adrift in a suddenly unstable world. Egyptian artists captured something of this human drama in their temple reliefs. We see sea people's warriors, yes, but we also see their families, their cattle, their household goods piled onto wagons. These are people who have left everything behind, carrying what they can, hoping to find safety or opportunity somewhere else. The fact that Egypt managed to turn them back speaks to Egyptian military skill, certainly, but also to the desperation of people who had literally nowhere else to go. The mystery of the Sea Peoples also reminds us how much of the ancient world remains invisible to us. These were clearly significant populations, large enough to threaten Egypt, organized enough to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles of coastline. Yet they left almost no written records of their own, no monumental architecture, no clear archaeological signature that we can point to and say, here, this is who they were. And perhaps that's fitting. The Sea Peoples were creatures of transition, of the chaotic period between the collapse of one world and the emergence of another. They existed in the spaces between civilizations, in the gaps in our historical record. They were both destroyers and victims, both cause and effect of one of history's great disruptions. As we think about these phantom raiders from the waves, we might ask ourselves whether they were really so different from the forces that shape our own interconnected world. Population movements, climate stress, the collision between established powers and displaced peoples, these patterns echo across the centuries, reminding us that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just ancient history, but a preview of the kinds of challenges that complex civilizations have always faced, and continue to face today. But the Sea Peoples were only one factor in this great collapse. To understand the full picture, we need to look beyond human actors to the natural forces that may have set these catastrophic events in motion. You know, when we think about ancient civilizations collapsing, our minds naturally turn to invasions, wars, political upheavals, human drama. But sometimes the most profound changes in history come not from what people do to each other, but from what nature does to all of us. And around 1200 BCE, nature was writing its own chapter in this story. Let's step back from the burning palaces and mysterious raiders for a moment and ask a more fundamental question: what was the weather like when the Bronze Age world began to crumble? This isn't just idle curiosity. Modern paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, has given us remarkable tools to peer back through the millennia and reconstruct what Earth's climate system was doing 3,000 years ago. We can read the story written in tree rings, in lake sediments, in ice cores from distant glacier. And what these natural archives tell us about the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE is troubling. The Eastern Mediterranean, it turns out, was experiencing one of the most severe climate shifts of the entire Bronze Age. Multiple lines of evidence point to a period of pronounced cooling and, more critically, devastating drought. Imagine you're a farmer in Mycenaean Greece around 1220 BCE. Your family has worked the same land for generations. The seasonal patterns your grandfather taught you, the timing of planting and harvest that has sustained your community for centuries, suddenly, they don't work anymore. The evidence comes from all across the region. Pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee show a dramatic drop in oak trees and other moisture-loving vegetation around this time, replaced by drought-resistant scrubland. In Anatolia, lake levels plummeted. Cyprus shows similar patterns of environmental stress. This wasn't a localized bad year or two, this was a fundamental shift in the climate system that lasted for decades. Now, you might be wondering, how severe could ancient drought really be? After all, these societies had dealt with dry spells before. But we're not talking about your typical agricultural challenge here. The paleoclimatic data suggests precipitation levels dropped by as much as 30 to 50% across much of the Eastern Mediterranean. In a world where agriculture was already pushing the limits of what the land could sustain, this was catastrophic. Think about what that means in practical terms. The Bronze Age palace economies we've been discussing, Pylos, Knossos, Hattusa, they weren't just administrative centers. They were the hubs of complex agricultural systems that collected surplus grain from hundreds of farming communities, stored it in massive granaries, and redistributed it to feed specialized craftsmen, soldiers, traders, and bureaucrats. When the rains fail year after year, that entire system breaks down. But the climate wasn't just becoming drier, it was also becoming more unpredictable. Tree ring data from the Aegean shows not just lower overall growth, but much more variable growth from year to year. This suggests not just persistent drought, but wild swings between wet and dry periods. For agricultural societies, unpredictability can be even more damaging than simple scarcity. You can adapt to consistent conditions, even harsh ones. But when the weather becomes erratic, planning becomes impossible. And here's where it gets really interesting from a systems perspective. These Bronze Age civilizations had spent centuries building increasingly sophisticated trade networks precisely because different regions specialized in different products. Cyprus provided copper, Egypt provided grain, the Levant provided cedar wood and purple dye. When climate change hits a system like this, the effects cascade in ways that are hard to predict. Let's trace one possible scenario. Drought strikes the grain-producing regions of the Levant and Anatolia. Suddenly, the steady supply of surplus wheat that Egyptian and Mycenaean merchants had been trading for metals and luxury goods dries up. Communities that had specialized in crafts or metallurgy because they could reliably import food find themselves facing starvation. They have two choices: abandon their settlements and migrate to better conditions, or turn to raiding to take what they need. This is where the climate story connects back to those mysterious sea peoples we discussed earlier. Many scholars now suspect that at least some of these maritime raiders were climate refugees, displaced populations from regions where traditional agriculture had become impossible. The Shiaden, the Peleset, the Denyen, these names that appear in Egyptian records as foreign invaders might represent communities fleeing environmental collapse in their homelands. But we shouldn't think of this as a simple cause and effect relationship. Climate change didn't directly destroy the Bronze Age palaces. Rather, it created conditions that made existing vulnerabilities impossible to manage. A centralized palace economy might weather a bad harvest or two by drawing on stored reserves or emergency trade agreements. But when the environmental stress continues year after year, when the fundamental assumptions about agricultural productivity no longer hold, these systems reach what complexity theorists call a tipping point. The timing is crucial here. The paleoclimatic evidence shows that this severe drought period began around 1250 BCE and intensified through 1200 BCE, exactly when we see the first signs of trouble at sites like Pylos and Ugaritic. It's not that every civilization collapsed at once in 1200 BCE, but rather that the environmental pressures building through the late 13th century finally overwhelmed their capacity to adapt. Interestingly, not all regions were affected equally. Egypt, with its dependable Nile floods, weathered the climate crisis much better than rain-dependent areas. The Nile's annual flood cycle was driven by monsoons in distant Ethiopia, not Mediterranean precipitation patterns, so Egyptian agriculture remained relatively stable. This might explain why Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse while its neighbors crumbled. Of course, we need to be careful not to oversimplify. Climate change was probably a necessary condition for the Bronze Age collapse, but it wasn't sufficient on its own. After all, these societies had survived droughts before. What made this particular climate shift so destructive was how it interacted with existing social tensions, political conflicts, and the inherent vulnerabilities of complex, interconnected systems. But as we'll see next, those interconnections, the very trade networks and diplomatic relationships that had made the Bronze Age world so prosperous, may have also made it fatally fragile when crisis struck. And here we arrive at something fascinating that researchers only began to understand in the late 20th century, the science of how complex systems fail. If you've ever wondered why a single delayed flight can cascade into airport-wide chaos, or how a small banking problem can trigger a global financial crisis, you're touching on the same principles that may have brought down Bronze Age civilization. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're building a tower of blocks with a child. At first, adding blocks makes the tower stronger, more impressive. But there's a point, a critical threshold, where adding just one more block brings the whole structure crashing down. The Bronze Age world, we're learning, may have built itself right up to that threshold. By 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean had become what complexity theorists call a tightly coupled system. Cyprus shipped copper to the Aegean. Anatolia provided tin. Egyptian gold flowed north while Baltic amber traveled south. Mycenaean pottery appeared in Levantine markets. Hittite grain fed populations hundreds of miles away. It was a beautiful, efficient web of interdependence that had taken centuries to develop. But here's what makes such systems dangerous: their very efficiency becomes their weakness. When everything is connected, when every part depends on every other part, there's no slack in the system. No room for error. One failure doesn't stay isolated, it ripples outward, growing stronger as it goes. The mathematician Purbach studied this phenomenon extensively in the 1990s, calling it self-organized criticality. He used sand piles as his model. Drops and grains onto a pile one by one, and for a while, each grain settles harmlessly. But eventually, you reach a critical state where the next grain triggers an avalanche. The remarkable thing is that you can't predict which grain will cause the collapse. The system organizes itself right to the edge of chaos. Now, let's apply this to our Bronze Age world. For 300 years, the Late Bronze Age system had been adding complexity, more trade routes, more diplomatic relationships, more specialized production centers. Each addition made the system more sophisticated, more capable, more prosperous. But it also made it more fragile. Consider the copper trade, something we can trace through archaeological remains. By 1200 BCE, bronze making had become incredibly specialized. Cyprus extracted the copper. Cornwall and Afghanistan provided tin, a rare metal that had to travel thousands of miles. Craftsmen in different regions developed specific techniques for working different alloys. It was a marvel of ancient globalization. But what happened when pirates disrupted the sea lanes? When drought hit Cyprus? When political upheaval closed the mines in Afghanistan? The system had no redundancy built in. There were no backup plans, no alternative supply chains. Everything had been optimized for efficiency under normal conditions. We see evidence of this brittleness in the Linear B tablets from Pylos, dating to just before the collapse. The scribes were desperately trying to manage shortages, reassigning bronze from ceremonial uses to military needs, tracking down missing livestock, attempting to maintain production quotas with inadequate raw materials. They were managing a system that was already failing, trying to hold together a network that had lost its structural integrity. The climate pressures we discussed earlier weren't just local problems, they were system-wide stressors. When the rains failed in one region, it didn't just affect local agriculture. It disrupted trade patterns, triggered population movements, created political instability that rippled across the network. A drought in Syria affected grain prices in Greece. Pastoral migrations in the Balkans disrupted trade routes to Anatolia. Modern network theorists have identified something called cascade failures. Think about the power grid during a heat wave. When one power plant fails, its load gets distributed to neighboring plants. If they're already running near capacity, they might fail too, passing their load further down the line. Within hours, a local problem becomes a regional blackout. The Bronze Age collapse shows every sign of being this kind of cascade failure. We see it in the archaeological record, sites abandoned not all at once, but in waves. First the peripheral settlements, then the secondary centers, finally the great palaces themselves. Each failure increased the pressure on the remaining nodes in the network. Perhaps most tellingly, we see evidence that the collapse accelerated as it progressed. The early disruptions, around 1250 BCE, affected individual sites or regions. By 1200 BCE, entire civilizations were disappearing within decades. The system had entered what chaos theorists call rapid phase transition, the equivalent of our sandpile avalanche, but on a civilizational scale. There's something almost eerie about reading the final tablets from Ugaritic with this perspective. The scribes weren't just recording the arrival of enemies, they were documenting the breakdown of their entire world system. When they wrote about ships that never arrived, about allied cities that had gone silent, about trade goods that were no longer flowing, they were watching their network collapse in real time. But here's what makes this story particularly relevant for us today. Our modern world is far more tightly coupled than the Bronze Age ever was. Our supply chains span the globe. Our financial systems are interconnected across continents. Our communication networks carry information at light speed. We've built a system of extraordinary complexity and efficiency. The question that keeps complexity theorists awake at night is whether we've learned enough from past collapses to build resilience into our systems, or whether we're simply building toward our own critical threshold. The Bronze Age world didn't have the benefit of understanding cascade failures or self-organized criticality. They built their interconnected system through trial and success, not knowing that each connection was also a potential pathway for failure. We have that knowledge now. We can see the warning signs, understand the dynamics, build in redundancies and circuit breakers. Whether we will remains an open question. But there's another factor we haven't fully explored yet, one that may have been just as important as these systemic vulnerabilities. Because while the Bronze Age world was building its fragile networks, something else was happening within these civilizations themselves. Their internal structures, their palace bureaucracies, their social contracts, may have been developing their own critical weaknesses. Sometimes the greatest threat to a civilization doesn't come charging across the horizon with swords and shields. Sometimes it grows quietly within the palace walls, in the careful columns of numbers that administrators scratch into clay tablets, in the mounting complaints of workers who haven't been paid, in the subtle rigidity that creeps into systems that once bent with the winds of change. We've talked about earthquakes and climate and mysterious sea raiders, but tonight we need to turn inward. Because there's a compelling argument that the Bronze Age world didn't just collapse, it suffocated under the weight of its own success. Picture, if you will, the palace at Pylos in the final decades before everything went dark. This wasn't just a royal residence, it was the beating heart of an entire regional economy. From its archive rooms, bureaucrats coordinated the movement of thousands of workers, tracked the production of everything from perfumed oil to bronze weapons, and managed land holdings that stretched across the southwestern Peloponnese. The Linear B tablets we've recovered paint a picture of breathtaking administrative complexity. But complexity, as we're learning, can be its own kind of trap. Let's slow down and consider what these tablets actually tell us about the final years. In the Pylos archives, we find records of bronzesmiths being assigned emergency rations, lists of coastal watchers being posted to guard against seaborne threats, and inventories that seem increasingly desperate in their attention to detail. One tablet meticulously records the collection of bronze objects from religious sanctuaries, temple offerings being melted down, we presume, for weapons. Another lists rowers for a fleet, but the numbers suggest they're scraping together crews from anyone they can find. These aren't the records of a confident, prosperous kingdom. They're the paper trail of a system under strain. You might be wondering how we can read so much into these ancient administrative notes. The answer lies in what economists call institutional sclerosis, the tendency for successful organizations to become increasingly rigid over time, developing complex rules and hierarchies that eventually stifle the very adaptability that made them successful in the first place. The Mycenaean palaces had evolved into something like ancient corporations. At Knossos, Linear B tablets reveal a bureaucratic pyramid with the king at the top, followed by provincial governors, local officials, land tenure supervisors, and specialized administrators for everything from livestock to textile production. Each level added its own procedures, its own requirements for documentation, its own resistance to change. When times were good, this system was remarkably efficient. The palaces could coordinate massive public works projects, maintain standing armies, and orchestrate trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. But efficiency and resilience aren't the same thing. And the times were becoming decidedly not good. We can see it in the archaeological record from sites across the Mycenaean world. In the decades before the collapse, there's evidence of declining population in rural areas, suggesting people were either dying, fleeing, or being drawn into the palace centers. Construction projects became smaller and more utilitarian, fewer grandiose tombs for the elite, more basic fortifications. The elegant pottery styles that had flourished for centuries began to simplify and standardize, as if artistic creativity was being sacrificed for mass production. At the same time, the tablets suggest the palace bureaucracies were becoming more, not less, controlling. They began micromanaging aspects of the economy that had previously been left to local initiative. Craftsmen who might once have worked independently found themselves assigned specific quotas and materials by palace officials. Local communities that had managed their own affairs suddenly had their agricultural production planned from the center. It's a pattern that will feel familiar to anyone who's watched modern organizations struggle with crisis. When external pressures mount, the instinct is often to tighten control, to centralize decision-making, to demand more detailed reporting. But this response can actually accelerate collapse by eliminating the local knowledge and flexibility that might have provided solutions. Consider the evidence from Ugaritic, where we have some of the most detailed records of this internal strain. In the city's final decades, legal documents show increasing disputes over property rights, complaints about unpaid debts, and conflicts between traditional local authorities and palace-appointed officials. The cosmopolitan trading networks that had made Ugaritic wealthy were still functioning, but the social fabric that held the city together was fraying. One particularly telling document is a letter from the last king of Ugaritic to his overlord in Carchemish, complaining that his own troops have deserted and his ships have been scattered. But what's striking is his tone. It's not the confident voice of a ruler managing a temporary setback, but the desperate plea of someone whose own people no longer trust the system he represents. This brings us to something crucial that we haven't talked about yet, the human cost of these rigid palace economies. The Linear B tablets are remarkably impersonal documents, focused on quantities and assignments rather than individual experiences. But reading between the lines, we can glimpse a world where ordinary people had less and less control over their own lives. Archaeological evidence suggests that social inequality was increasing in the final Bronze Age period. Elite graves became more elaborate while common burials grew simpler. Palace storage areas expanded while evidence for household-level food storage declined, suggesting that more resources were being concentrated in administrative centers. The average farmer or craftsman was becoming increasingly dependent on palace distribution systems for basic necessities. When those systems came under stress, whether from climate pressures, military threats, or simple administrative overload, ordinary people found themselves trapped. They couldn't easily return to subsistence farming because they'd been integrated into specialized palace economies. They couldn't flee to other regions because every major center was developing similar problems. They couldn't adapt or innovate because the bureaucratic structures controlling their lives had become too rigid to permit experimentation. So when the external shocks finally came, the droughts, the earthquakes, the mysterious raiders from the sea, these civilizations didn't bend. They shattered. Their very success had made them brittle. But here's what makes this internal decay hypothesis particularly unsettling for us modern observers. We're not looking at Bronze Age civilizations that were primitive or poorly organized. We're looking at societies that had achieved remarkable levels of administrative sophistication, international connectivity, and economic specialization. They were, in their own way, addressing many of the same challenges we face today. And that raises a question that will follow us into our next section, as we explore another potential cause of the Bronze Age collapse. If complex societies can become too rigid to survive, if success can breed its own destruction, what does that tell us about our own elaborate systems and careful controls? Sometimes the ground doesn't have to shake for everything to fall down. But sometimes, the ground literally does shake. We've explored climate change, invasions, and internal decay, all compelling theories for why Bronze Age civilization crumbled. But there's another possibility, one that archaeologists have been quietly piecing together for decades. What if the collapse wasn't gradual at all? What if, instead of slow decline, these ancient societies faced something more immediate and terrifying? Imagine you're standing in the Great Palace at Knossos around 1200 BCE. The walls adorned with those famous frescoes of bull leapers and dolphins, the massive storage jars filled with olive oil and wine. You feel the first tremor, perhaps just enough to rattle the pottery. Then another, stronger this time. And then the world begins to tear itself apart. This is the earthquake storm hypothesis, and it's based on something rather unsettling that geologists have discovered about how our planet behaves. Earthquakes don't always come one at a time. Sometimes they arrive in clusters, in what scientists call earthquake storms, periods when seismic activity cascades across interconnected fault systems, triggering one disaster after another. The eastern Mediterranean sits on one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The African plate pushes northward into the Eurasian plate, creating a web of fault lines that runs right through the heartland of Bronze Age civilization. The Dead Sea transform, the Aegean Arc, the North Anatolian Fault, these aren't just lines on a geological map. They're the pressure points where continents collide. Now, here's where things get interesting. When archaeologists excavate Bronze Age sites across this region, they find something peculiar. Layer after layer of destruction, but not from fire or warfare alone. Collapsed walls that fell inward. Massive stone blocks displaced in ways that suggest violent shaking. At Mycenae, the famous Lion Gate shows clear signs of seismic damage. At Troy, archaeologists found evidence of earthquake destruction in multiple layers. But it's not just one site, or even one region. Excavations from Greece to Turkey to the Levant reveal a pattern of destruction that seems to spread like a contagion across the landscape. Knossos in Crete shows earthquake damage around 1200 BCE. So does Tiryns on the Greek mainland. Hattusa, the mighty Hittite capital, bears the scars of violent structural collapse. You might be wondering, couldn't warfare cause similar destruction? Absolutely. But there are telltale signs that help archaeologists distinguish between human violence and geological violence. Earthquakes create specific patterns of damage. Walls fall in predictable ways based on the direction of seismic waves. Storage vessels shatter in particular patterns. Most tellingly, earthquake damage often shows attempts at repair, evidence that survivors tried to rebuild before ultimately abandoning their homes. This is exactly what we see across the Bronze Age world. At site after site, archaeologists find evidence of hasty repairs followed by final abandonment. It's as if these civilizations were struggling against repeated disasters, patching their world back together only to watch it collapse again. The Paleoseismic record, the geological evidence of ancient earthquakes, supports this picture. Sediment cores from lakes across the region show evidence of massive seismic activity around 1200 BCE. Underwater archaeology in the eastern Mediterranean has revealed submerged settlements that appear to have been suddenly abandoned, their pottery and tools left scattered on what were once dry land surfaces. But here's what makes the earthquake storm hypothesis particularly compelling: it explains not just the destruction, but the timing. Complex societies can often survive individual disasters. They rebuild, they adapt, they carry on. What they struggle with is multiple, rapid-fire catastrophes that overwhelm their ability to recover. Imagine you're the ruler of a Bronze Age kingdom. Your capital suffers earthquake damage, but you mobilize resources to rebuild. Then, 6 months later, another quake strikes. You rebuild again, but now your treasury is depleted, your workforce exhausted. A year later, another tremor brings down structures you've just repaired. How many times can a civilization get back up? This cascading failure model helps explain something that's always puzzled historians: why the Bronze Age collapse was so thorough, so widespread, and so rapid. Individual disasters, whether climate change, invasion, or internal conflict, might explain the fall of one kingdom or city. But an earthquake storm could trigger a domino effect across the entire interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's compelling evidence for exactly this kind of cascade effect in more recent history. The 1939 Erzincan earthquake in Turkey triggered a series of seismic events that continued for decades along the North Anatolian Fault. Each earthquake increased stress on neighboring fault segments, creating a chain reaction of destruction that marched westward across Anatolia. Now imagine this process unfolding in the Bronze Age, when societies lacked modern emergency response systems, when communication was slow, and when trade networks were the lifeline connecting distant civilizations. An earthquake in Anatolia doesn't just destroy Hittite cities, it disrupts the flow of metals and goods that other societies depend on. A tremor that collapses harbors in the Aegean doesn't just affect local shipping, it breaks the commercial links that hold the Bronze Age world together. Suddenly, the earthquake storm hypothesis begins to tie together all the other theories we've explored. Climate change makes societies more vulnerable to additional shocks. Internal tensions mean there are fewer resources available for disaster recovery. When the ground starts shaking, weakened civilizations find themselves unable to cope with both geological catastrophe and the human conflicts that follow. But we need to be careful here. The earthquake storm hypothesis is compelling, but it's not the complete answer. Earthquakes are dramatic, but they're also recoverable disasters if you have the resources, the social cohesion, and the time. What made the Bronze Age collapse so devastating wasn't just the shaking ground, but the perfect storm of pressures that these societies were already facing. Still, there's something profound about imagining these ancient civilizations facing the fundamental unpredictability of the Earth itself. All their careful planning, their elaborate trade networks, their sophisticated technologies, and then the very ground beneath their feet becomes an enemy. In those moments when the palace walls swayed and the storage jars shattered, the Bronze Age world may have realized just how fragile their carefully constructed civilization truly was. As we'll see next, some societies found ways to survive even this perfect storm of disasters. But for those who didn't, the earthquake storms of 1200 BCE marked the end of one chapter of human history and the violent birth of another. So here we are, standing in the aftermath of one of history's great catastrophes, and you might be wondering, did anyone make it through? Was this truly the end of Bronze Age civilization, or were there survivors picking their way through the wreckage, building something new from what remained? The answer, as it turns out, is both more complex and more hopeful than you might expect. While the great palace centers fell and entire civilizations vanished from the historical record, the collapse wasn't quite as complete as we sometimes imagine. Think of it less like a sudden extinction and more like a massive forest fire, devastating, yes, but leaving behind scattered groves of survivors, and eventually, new growth. Let's start with Egypt, because in many ways, the survival of Egyptian civilization is one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story. You'll remember that Egypt faced its own invasion by the Sea Peoples, fought off by Ramesses III in those dramatic naval battles we discussed earlier. But while Egypt survived, it didn't emerge unchanged. The Egyptian empire that had once projected power across the Levant and into Anatolia was greatly diminished. The new kingdom was winding down, and Egypt was entering what scholars call the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and reduced international influence. Yet Egypt's survival tells us something important about resilience. Unlike the palace-centered economies of the Mycenaeans or Hittites, Egypt's civilization was built around the Nile River's annual flood cycle, a natural rhythm that had sustained the country for millennia. When the Bronze Age trade networks collapsed, Egypt could fall back on this fundamental agricultural foundation. The pharaohs might have lost their international prestige, but Egyptian farmers continued to plant and harvest along the Nile much as they always had. Now, let's turn our attention to an island that played a crucial role in both the collapse and the recovery, Cyprus. You might not immediately think of Cyprus as a major player in ancient geopolitics, but this Mediterranean island was actually one of the Bronze Age world's most important sources of copper, the metal that gave the age its name. When the great trading networks began to break down, you might expect Cyprus to suffer terribly. After all, what good is being a source of raw materials when there's no one left to trade with? But Cyprus adapted. Archaeological evidence shows that while some Cypriot cities were indeed destroyed around 1200 BCE, others continued functioning. The copper mines kept operating, and Cypriot traders found new markets and new trading partners. Instead of shipping copper ingots to Mycenaean palaces or Hittite administrators, they began dealing with smaller, more localized communities. The scale changed, but the trade continued. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the post-collapse world, the emergence of new peoples and new cultures from the ruins of the old. In the Levant, among the most significant of these new arrivals were the Philistines. Now, you've probably heard of the Philistines from biblical accounts, where they're typically portrayed as the enemies of the Israelites. But from an archaeological perspective, the Philistines represent something much more interesting. They were likely among the sea peoples who had participated in the great migrations and raids of the collapse period. What's remarkable about the Philistines is how they established themselves not as mere raiders or destroyers, but as settlers who created a new kind of society. They built cities along the southern Levantine coast, places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, that blended elements of their presumed Aegean origins with local Canaanite traditions. Their pottery shows clear influences from Mycenaean styles, suggesting these people may have originally come from the Greek world before the collapse drove them eastward. But here's what's really intriguing: the Philistines didn't just occupy the ruins of Bronze Age cities. They actively rebuilt and reorganized them. At sites like Tel Mikne, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated urban planning, industrial districts for olive oil production, and even what appears to be a brewery. These weren't nomadic raiders living in the remains of someone else's civilization. These were people creating something new. We see similar patterns elsewhere in the post-collapse world. In Anatolia, while the great Hittite cities lay abandoned, smaller communities continued to exist, maintaining local traditions and eventually developing into what we now call the Neo-Hittite kingdoms of the early Iron Age. In Greece, while the Mycenaean palaces fell, Greek-speaking people survived in smaller settlements, eventually giving rise to the city-states of the classical period. This raises a question that cuts to the heart of how we understand historical change. Were these survivors truly maintaining their old civilizations in diminished form, or were they creating something fundamentally new? The answer probably depends on how you define civilization itself. If we're talking about monumental architecture, complex bureaucracies, and extensive trade networks, then yes, Bronze Age civilization largely ended around 1200 BCE. But if we're talking about the continuity of human communities, technologies, and cultural practices, then the picture becomes much more nuanced. Consider language, for instance. While Linear B disappeared with the Mycenaean palaces, Greek continued to be spoken. While Hittite hieroglyphs fell out of use, related languages persisted in Anatolia. The collapse disrupted the systems that preserved these languages in written form, but the languages themselves survived in the mouths of the people who spoke them. What emerges from this period of survival and adaptation is a world that was smaller in scale but perhaps more diverse and innovative. Without the dominating presence of great empires, smaller communities had space to develop their own solutions to the challenges of life in the ancient world. New technologies spread, ironworking became more widespread, partly because iron ore was more abundant and accessible than the tin needed for bronze. New forms of social organization emerged, less centralized but often more flexible than the rigid palace bureaucracies of the Bronze Age. Perhaps most importantly, the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse carried forward the memory of what had been lost. In Greece, this took the form of epic poetry that preserved stories of the heroic age. The Iliad and Odyssey, composed centuries after the collapse, are in many ways cultural artifacts of this process of remembering and rebuilding. They speak to a time when heroes lived in great palaces and sailed across the wine-dark sea, a nostalgic vision of the Bronze Age world, seen through the eyes of those who came after. As we move toward our final thoughts, it's worth reflecting on what these survivors can teach us about resilience in the face of systemic collapse. So here we are, at the end of our journey through one of history's most profound mysteries. We've walked through the ruins of Hattusa, stood among the silent stones of Mycenae, and imagined the last frantic letters being written in Ugaritic as unknown enemies approached from the sea. We've examined earthquake damage and climate data, traced trade routes and palace bureaucracies, and tried to understand how an entire world, sophisticated, interconnected, thriving, could simply vanish in the space of a few generations. But as we prepare to leave the Bronze Age behind, it's impossible not to notice the uncomfortable parallels staring back at us across 32 centuries. The late Bronze Age world was, in many ways, our world's ancient mirror. Think about it: global trade networks connecting distant civilizations, complex bureaucracies managing vast resources, urban centers dependent on agricultural hinterlands, and societies increasingly stratified between elites and everyone else. Sound familiar? The Mycenaean palace scribes, hunched over their Linear B tablets, recording every jar of olive oil and every head of cattle, weren't so different from our own data analysts tracking supply chains and inventory levels. The Hittite diplomats, carefully negotiating treaties and trade agreements across thousands of miles, understood the same fundamental truth that drives our modern economy: everything is connected, and that connection is both a strength and a vulnerability. When we look at the evidence for the Bronze Age collapse, the climate stress, the social tensions recorded in those final palace archives, the signs of systems pushed beyond their breaking points, we're not just studying ancient history. We're looking at a case study in how complex civilizations respond to cascading crises. And honestly, the Bronze Age world didn't respond particularly well. This isn't to say we should panic or assume that history simply repeats itself. But there's something deeply sobering about realizing that the challenges we face today, climate change, social inequality, the vulnerability of our interconnected systems, are not entirely new. The Bronze Age civilizations faced their own version of each of these problems, and despite their remarkable achievements, they couldn't solve them. Consider the climate evidence we discussed earlier. The paleoclimatic data shows cooling temperatures and reduced rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean between roughly 1250 and 1100 BCE. Agricultural yields would have dropped. Trade routes would have shifted. Populations would have moved. And the tightly integrated Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication, couldn't adapt quickly enough to these changing conditions. Now think about our own relationship with climate. We have far more advanced technology than the Bronze Age world ever dreamed of, but we also have far more complex systems to maintain and far more people to feed. When climate scientists talk about tipping points and cascading failures, they're describing phenomena that the Bronze Age world experienced firsthand. The question that keeps many researchers awake at night is whether our greater complexity makes us more resilient or more vulnerable to the kind of systemic shocks that brought down the palace civilizations. Then there's the social dimension. Those linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos reveal a world of stark inequality, palace elites controlling vast resources while common people struggled with increasing demands for taxes and labor. The archaeological evidence suggests that these tensions were mounting in the decades before the collapse. Palace walls grew higher and thicker. Weapons became more common in settlements. The Bronze Age world was becoming more militarized, more stratified, more brittle. You might be wondering if we're heading down the same path. Our own societies show many of the same warning signs: growing inequality, increasing social tensions, the concentration of wealth and power in fewer hands. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that no matter how sophisticated a civilization becomes, it's ultimately built on social cooperation. And when that cooperation breaks down, even the most impressive palaces can become empty ruins. But here's what's fascinating about the Bronze Age collapse, and here's where we might find some cautious optimism: it wasn't actually the end of the world. Yes, the palace civilizations fell. Yes, trade networks collapsed and cities were abandoned. Yes, entire writing systems disappeared. But people survived. They adapted. They rebuilt. The collapse was followed by what historians used to call the Dark Ages, but we know now that this period wasn't quite as dark as once believed. New technologies spread more widely. Ironworking, for instance, became democratized after the fall of the palace monopolies. New forms of social organization emerged. The alphabet was invented, making writing more accessible than the complex scripts controlled by Bronze Age palace scribes. In many ways, the collapse cleared the ground for innovations that would eventually lead to the classical civilizations we know better: the Greece of Athens and Sparta, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus. The Bronze Age collapse was catastrophic for those who lived through it, but it wasn't permanent. This doesn't mean we should welcome collapse or assume that everything will work out fine in the end. The human cost of the Bronze Age collapse was enormous: cities destroyed, populations displaced, knowledge lost, lives disrupted. But it does suggest something important about human resilience. Even when our grandest systems fail, even when our most impressive achievements crumble, people find ways to carry on. As we close tonight's exploration, I want you to imagine something. Picture yourself walking through the ruins of Mycenae or Hattusa on a quiet evening, just as the sun is setting behind the ancient stones. The palaces are silent now, their corridors empty, their treasuries looted long ago. But if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes, not just of the collapse, but of everything that came after. The Bronze Age world fell, but its people didn't disappear. They told stories to their children about the great palaces and the heroes who once lived there. They passed down technologies and traditions, adapted and evolved them, planted the seeds for new civilizations. In the end, that might be the most important lesson the Bronze Age collapse offers us: not a warning about inevitable doom, but a reminder of our remarkable capacity to endure, to adapt, and to begin again. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through deep time. Until next time, this has been the Twilight Archive, where wonder takes its time and the past speaks softly to the present. Sleep well.